That's good. And I think
don't let people know they're being watched. Speakers get all freaked out.
people have a US. Sign a blog.
It's really cool. It's a cool class. And I totally probably not like a basic, but like, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, you have to do like, you know, one history, one cultural, blah, blah, blah. And then you have to take a certain number of classes.
And I'm very well, I'm focusing on my calendar. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We hope that you enjoyed the breakout sessions. We'd like to welcome you now to the fourth and final panel of the China-US Symposium titled Turbulent Water, the Future of the South China Sea. On behalf of Jack Dunkelman, Eric Warfield, Sean Gunn, Jiacheng Zhu, our panelists, and everyone who has worked on this panel over the past several months, welcome. I'd now like to briefly give an introduction to our moderator who will be taking over from here. Our moderator today will be Professor Michael Beckley. He is an assistant professor of political science at Tufts, where he studies the rise and fall of great powers in US and Chinese foreign policy. Prior to Tufts, Michael held fellowships at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and Dartmouth College, and worked at the US Department of Defense, the RAND Corporation, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Michael's research has been featured in a variety of academic journals and popular media, including Foreign Policy, International Security, the Financial Times, and the Journal of Strategic Studies, and so on. So without further ado, let's get this panel started. Please welcome Professor Michael Beckley.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming to this last but best panel of the US-China Symposium. We're talking about the South China Sea, and I'm sure this is an issue that's been on a lot of your minds. It's been in the news a lot lately. This, of course, used to be sort of an unexplored backwater, but recently has become one of the most important bodies of water in the world in both economic and strategic terms. You can look at all the statistics online, but there's things that say, you know, more than half of maritime trade, if you measure it by tonnage, passes through the South China Sea every year, which makes it its sea lanes some of the most heavily traveled sea lanes in the entire world. There's more than 10 million tons of fish that are hauled out of the South China Sea every single year, which makes it, of course, a prime fishing spot. It's critical to feed a growing population in and around Asia. And now, because of new technology, people can exploit the reserves of oil and gas that lie under its seabed. And even though it's not known how much oil and gas lies under the seabed, there's estimates, if you look at the US Energy Information Agency, for example, estimates that there's anywhere between 5 to 22 billion barrels of oil and 70 to 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So who controls these resources? Who's going to be managing them? As I think will become clear over the course of the next few talks, international law gives every country kind of a zone, a 12 nautical mile zone out from their shores, that's their territorial waters, and a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which is not sovereign territory, but they get first dibs on the resources that are found under there. And so these principles in international law give tiny little rocks and atolls and reefs tremendous importance because their owners can use them as sort of footholds to project their landmass out into the South China Sea and to claim whatever resources they find in and around it. So the South China Sea contains several of these clusters and outcroppings. You have the Paracel Islands, which are located in the northern part of the sea, and they're about equidistant between Vietnam and China. There's about 30 small islands, other land formations, and they're scattered over about 6,000 square miles of water. And then the other major group is the Spratly Islands, which are located farther south, about 300 miles from the coast of Vietnam, 700 miles from China's Hainan Island. And these consist of over 100 small land formations, and they're spread over about 160,000 square miles of land. And the thing is, if you take these little rocks and these holes as a whole, there's only about 10 to 20 square miles of land surface that's actually above the water, although that's rapidly changing, as some of our speakers will probably talk about. But the bottom line is few of these are naturally habitable. But if countries can use them as the basis for extending their claims and their exclusive economic zones, then they could potentially provide title to the vast majority of the South China Sea. So of course, most of the countries around the sea, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, China, Taiwan, they lay claim to some or most or all of these islands, and of course their claims overlap in certain sort of conflictual and difficult to resolve ways. And the problem is there's many different bases for staking a claim to these islands. Anything from first discovery, historical possession, geographical connection to the country's continental shelf. So you can always find some kind of justification for your country's claim. And in recent years, of course, there's been a series of incidents, some involving oil rigs, others involving Coast Guard vessels, sometimes naval ships. And so I think the title of our panel is appropriate. These are turbulent waters. So to navigate these turbulent waters, we have three esteemed experts. The first, and we'll be hearing from first, is Bill Hayden. He has worked for the BBC since 1998. He's had long-term postings in Vietnam and Myanmar. He currently works for the BBC, for the World News TV of the BBC in London. And he's the author of a new book, The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, which was published by Yale University Press in October 2014 and has been nominated as one of The Economist's top books of the year. We'll also hear from Lyle Goldstein, who is a professor in China Maritime Studies in the China Maritime Studies Institute, where he served as the founding director from 2006 to 2011, and for which he has been awarded the Superior Civilian Service Medal. He's the author of a book which has actually also just come out called Meeting China Halfway, How to Diffuse the Emerging US-China Rivalry, which has just been published by Georgetown University Press. And last but not least, we'll be hearing from Ivan Rasmussen, who is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School. He's also a research fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for International Security and an associate at the RAND Corporation, among many other jobs. And his forthcoming dissertation is titled Rational Nationalism on the Rise, Chinese Public Opinion and Foreign Relations, and it focuses in part on how nationalist protest in China affects other countries' strategies in the South China Sea. And it will undoubtedly become a forthcoming book in its own right. But first, we're going to hear from Bill Hayden, so I'll turn it over to him now.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you for the great introduction. Disclaimer, I work for the BBC, but not today. Right? These are my thoughts. Don't blame the licensing impaired. Right. So I'm going first simply chronologically. I'm going to sort of try and fill in how we got to the strange situation that we're in now, in terms of who claims which bits of rock and who occupies them. And I won't go into so much about kind of the justification. Just I want you to kind of throw out a lot of what you might think you know about the history of the South China Sea. If any of you have been to a Chinese geography lesson, you might recognize this. I'm told that your average 8th grade Chinese geography student, one of the first things they do is get a ruler out in their lesson, and they measure from here to here, and they work out just how big China's territory is. And what's so important about this little spot on the Earth's surface, this is a place called the James Shoal, known in Chinese as the Zhengmu Anshan. And it's officially the southernmost point of Chinese territory. And trying to work out why that came to be gave me the insight into the history of these conflicts. Because you can see it's not a continental shelf. The sea in between is between 3,000 and 5,000 meters deep. It's a very strange place to pick as the southernmost point of Chinese territory, particularly because there's nothing there. It's just a piece of seabed. There's no island, there's no reef, it's just a piece of seabed. Why that piece of seabed? Chinese commentators often talk about the long history of Chinese navigation in the South China Sea. Admiral Cheng He, the Ming dynasty admiral, is famous for his voyages. He was one of several admirals that voyaged around Southeast Asia and as far as Africa in the 15th century. But what's important to know about him is that at this time, no sane navigator ever went near the middle of the South China Sea. This is not an old map, this is a 79 map, but it's based on Ming era charts. And as you can see, quite sensibly, the proper routes were to go around the edge because the inside of the middle of the sea was very dangerous. And on this map, you can see that there was a belief that there was an archipelago of islands that ran all the way down the coast of Vietnam. This is from a European map of 1630. You'll find this archipelago marked on every map produced up until about the 1820s, when the British finally got in there with some measuring instruments and proved that this archipelago didn't exist. But that was one reason why people didn't sail across the middle of the sea, was because they thought they would run aground here. So actually the people that used the middle of the sea, used the reefs, were generally migrant people, sea gypsies, orang laut as they're called in Indonesia, or bajau in the Philippines and Malaysia. They were itinerant, they lived on the sea, and often at times of stress they became pirates. So we need to think about the South China Sea not as a place where any state authority was imposed or ruled, but as an ungoverned space. This is a picture of an execution of pirates in Kowloon in 1891, the one that had their heads chopped off. And piracy was a major problem throughout the 19th century, in the early part and the late part, well into the 20th century, because these spaces were ungoverned. The problem now is that people with national agendas try to project the idea of a state authority back in time and say these places were administered. They were not. There was no state authority over these things. It's a historical nonsense to use modern terms such as sovereignty over the pre-modern period in the South China Sea. So, for example, here is a map published in China in 1897 of Guangdong province. There are no islands marked, okay? There was no interest in administering the islands in 1897. Okay, what changes is the sense of national humiliation in China. The century of national humiliation from 1840 to 1949, the Opium War, the Boxer Rebellion, the carve-up of China. That's what's important. It's the sense of violation. And I would say the key moment in this history is 1907 to 1909. The occupation of Pratas Island, which is a reef between Hong Kong and Taiwan, by a Japanese entrepreneur who was digging up bird shit to fertilize the fields back in Taiwan. Guano was a major commodity in the 19th and early 20th century. And from this bird shit crisis, we end up with national claim today. And so what happened was the Japanese, so because of all the sensitivities about the Boxer Rebellion and so forth, and the decline of the Qing, we've got a very strong nationalistic atmosphere, particularly in southern China. The Japanese guys found on Pratas Island there was a boycott of Japanese goods initiated, and the Japanese government tries to find a solution. Actually, what happens was the Chinese, the Guangdong authority, I think, buy him out for 130,000 silver dollars, and he agrees to give up his claim and give the reef to China. But while all this is going on, so the governor of Guangdong sends a voyage to the Paracels. And in the aftermath of this voyage, for the first time in 1909, we see the Paracel Islands appear on the Chinese map. Okay, 6th of June 1909, the first time any Chinese official ever set foot on a Paracel Island. Okay, it's not an ancient claim. 6th of June 1909. All right. So, and this map probably was actually copied from the German map. It wasn't a Chinese map. But what's going on here is a profound anxiety in China about the nature of Chinese territory. Because under the Qing dynasty, there is no map with a line on it that says this is Chinese territory and this is somebody else's territory. You have a diminishing political authority which sort of radiates away from the capital. So that in border areas, rulers pay homage to more than one imperial capital. I mean, in some ways, this is the origin of the Senkaku dispute, because the people who ruled the Ryukyu Islands were paying homage to Beijing and to Tokyo at the same time. Okay? And the same things happen around Yunnan and the difficulties on the Vietnamese border and so forth. But this issue of where China's territory rightfully belongs persists for a long period of time. So the first map of the Republic of China doesn't show any borders. That's very bizarre to our way of thinking, because these questions could not be resolved, because the state didn't know where its territory lay. Instead, you get vague mentions of Vietnam and Korea, formerly our vassal, but we're not going to draw a line to rule them in or rule them out. And in this void of understanding about where China's territory truly lies in the early 20th century, the private sector steps in, educators and nationalists, to make their own case for where China's territory should be. And so you get individuals like, in this case, Hu Jinji, publishing his own atlas showing a line. The atlas exists in the University of British Columbia Library, and one day I will get round to getting a copy of it. But he draws a line across the South China Sea, and this is supposed to be the first modern Chinese map to show this line. It's supposed to indicate a historical claim, but it only includes the Paracel Islands and the Cantons. I've got a number of these maps, but this is the best one. 1927, so those of you who read Chinese, map of national humiliation at the top there. This is a map produced by the Zhongguo Book Company, one of the top 3 publishers in Shanghai, in China, in the pre-Second World War, pre-revolutionary period. And what this map is supposed to show is this is the territory of China, but this is the rightful territory of China. Okay? And these bits have been taken away from China by the Japanese, by the Russians, by the British, by the French, and everybody else. And you can see it goes down to include the Sulu Sultanate down here, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Iran, Afghanistan, because these are ideas of where China's historic territory has been, based on the idea that these places once sent tribute at some point to the emperor in historic times. So therefore, they are the rightful territory of China in the eyes of the person who made this map. And this map, as you can see, was sold at a relatively cheap price as a piece of nationalist education. It was given out as a part of a propagandizing mission in the early 20th century. And there are a number of other similar maps, which I've cut for time. Moving into the 30s now, it's a complicated period. Obviously, you've got Japan on the rise, you've got French and Chinese and Japanese competition in the South China Sea. And what happens in this period is in 1930, the government attempts to regularize Chinese maps to finally answer these questions about where its authority begins and ends. And while this is going on, the French, who are concerned about the Japanese, annex the Spratly Islands, or at least 9 named Spratly Islands. And this causes a complete panic in Beijing, or Nanjing as the capital was, because it's not clear which islands have been annexed. The Chinese government does not know where these islands are. And in fact, there's correspondence between the Chinese government and the Chinese consul in Manila, who is asked to go and ask the Americans for a map to show the Chinese government where the islands are that the French have just annexed. The point is that the Republic of China does not know where the islands are in 1933. And in September 1933, there's a meeting of the ROC Military Council in which they agree they will not object to the French claim because China does not have a claim in the Spratly Islands. But yet, 14 years later, they are pursuing a claim in the Spratly Islands. As part of this process of naming or trying to define borders, this government committee draws up a list of names for the islands and the other features in the South China Sea. But what's interesting is that this list of names went through 3 evolutions. In 35, it was given a list of names. They were revised in 47 and revised in 83. And if you look at the 1935 list, this is the official ROC list, they are in most cases either translations or transliterations of the existing British or international names. So my favorite example is Jinyingdao, which is, excuse my pronunciation, Money Island. Yeah? But it's not money as in money, it's money as in William Taylor Money, who was the chief superintendent of the Bombay Marine, the Navy of the East India Company, in the same way that Patel Island and Drummond Island were also senior figures in the East India Company. So it's kind of funny, isn't it, that the Chinese name now honours a British imperialist to this day, because China didn't know where the name came from. So a lot of the other names, for example, North Danger Reef, are simply translated into Chinese as Beixian. Or Scarborough Shoal was simply transliterated as Sigurbaolo, just the transliteration of Scarborough. In 47, the nationalists decided that wasn't a very good name, so they changed its name to Minzhuo, Democracy Reef. But it's obviously not, it's not an ancient name, it's not the kind of name that fishermen give to a reef. It was a name given by a committee. But in 1983, Beijing thought that was subversive, they changed its name to Huangyan, to Yellow Rock. So when China says it's the first country to name the islands in the South China Sea, well, yeah, 1983, that was the first time that name was given. And there are many other examples I can give. This is the map they produced back at the time. But what's interesting, and this brings us back to James Scholl, is that down here, James Scholl, James Zhengmu, simply the transliteration. To this day, it honours the British name James that was originally given to it by the British. Scholl is now known, it's known as Zhengmu Ansha. Ansha is a reef. But back in 1935, the committee didn't know how to translate shoal. So they translated it as tan, which means sandbank or an island, a physical feature that you can walk on. Okay? But there is nothing there. It's just a piece of shallow sea. It's 22 meters below sea level. So the shoal means shallow, but it became an island in a Chinese government committee meeting. So if we go back down here, so for example, here the map shows an island with Zhengmu Tan, but it's not a tan, okay, it's an ansha. So another little piece, I mean, so many bits of the received wisdom are wrong on this. So, for example, when the Chinese annexed, when the French announced their annexation of the Spratly Islands, there is still to this day a belief that the Chinese government made a formal diplomatic protest. I've been trying to work out where, because there's no other evidence for it, where this source comes from. And so there's a key reference. This is Jiang Mingshen, New York-based lawyer, wrote this paper, came out in 1997, in which he ascribes it to a paper that was published in 1975. You go back and chase the reference. Ultimately, the reference comes back to a Shanghai newspaper published in 1948, 15 years after the event. There is no other proof. Okay, so this is a myth that has grown up from this Shanghai newspaper in 1948, and this paper here was referenced 170 times by the CNA. You know Daniel Hartnett yesterday who came. So he's writing a paper for so his organisation, not him, is writing a paper for the Pentagon, which came out last year, which is using Chinese propaganda from 1948 as the foundation for informing the Pentagon's understanding of the South China Sea. So it's all getting a bit ridiculous. But back on, okay. Second World War, Japanese occupying the islands, Americans bombed them. That's a picture of the napalming of Taiping Dao, Itu Aba, in the 1st of May 1945. There is a belief, again, that the Chinese forces took the surrender of the Japanese islands in 1945. That's not the case. Here's a report from an American ship or submarine, the Sea Fox, showing that in fact, when they investigated the islands in November, they found no Japs. They were hoping for a fight, but they couldn't find it. All the Japanese had evacuated. So for a year at the end of the Second World War, all of the islands were unoccupied by any country. And then there's a return, there's a race between France and China. France gets to the Spratlys first, China gets to the Parasols first. A little point of information, the ships that the Chinese forces, the Taiping was formerly the USS M Battle, the Yongtsin was formerly the USS something else. That was the Decca, that was the M Battle. They were American ships that were given to the Chinese Navy, which allowed the Chinese to get to the Spratly Islands and Paracel Islands. This is the very first time any Chinese official ever set foot on the Spratly Islands, the 12th of December, 1946. This is the map that was then published, and the famous U-shaped line going around the South China Sea. What does it mean? Well, it seems that at that time it was supposed to just simply indicate these islands are ours, and the ones outside it are not ours. But it's taken a life of its own since then. The Philippines has a strange claim. This man, Thomas Clomer, claimed it for himself, claimed the islands for himself, not for the Philippines, but for himself, as his own business empire in 1956. I always thought this guy was a bit of a joke, but what he did in 1956 was set off a whole chain of events which prompted the Taiwanese to claim the islands, then the Vietnamese, then Beijing. Everybody starts sending ships and troops. His kind of slightly eccentric mission in 1956 triggers everything that then follows. But the Philippines formally occupies them in the 70s, thinking that there's oil under the islands. And they were, in effect, after Taiwan, they were then the next country to move. Vietnam then gets in on the act. Along the way, in 74, China, which is occupying the eastern half of the Paracel Islands, invades the western half, kicks out the Vietnamese, which prompts the Vietnamese to fortify their position in the Spratly Islands. They move into the Spratlys in the 70s. Malaysia, we're just about to talk about how China has been pouring concrete and making bases, but this is what Swallow Reef looked like in 1978. That's what it looks like now. The Malaysians got in on the acts in the 80s and built bases. China PRC doesn't get in on the acts until late 87, early 88. This is a still from a movie made by the People's Liberation Army Navy in 1988 on the Battle of Johnson Reef, which was won when the Chinese Navy machine gunned all the Vietnamese troops that were standing knee-deep in water, killing about 60 people. So China moves very late into the Spratlys, and by the time it gets there, everything that's worth occupying is already gone. So the only things that China occupies in the Spratlys are things which are either just rocks or would be underwater at high tide. But it's worth saying, this is the sort of rough state of play as it is today. The largest single real estate owner is Vietnam. Vietnam occupies more than half of the Spratly Islands. Philippines occupies a group up here. Malaysia's ones are down here. Taiwan's the biggest island of Taiwan, typing down in the middle. Okay, and then the PRC has moved in key places there, Mischief Reef, and a couple of, it's about 7. These are the ones which are being turned into airstrips and harbours now, but they are the same ones that China has been occupying since 87, 88, or in the case of Mischief Reef, 95. So these are not new occupations, these are very old occupations, but they have become much more significant because of the kind of space and facilities that they are now developing. Why does China not like UNCLOS? Okay, this map explains why the UN Convention of the Sea is not likely to be the basis of the solution. Because, okay, it might be hard to see. Here's land. Here's the U-shaped line. That's the important thing there. There's the U-shaped line. If you take an UNCLOS-based solution, you say, right, if you have an island, if you have a rock, you get a 12 nautical mile territorial sea around it. If it's capable of supporting human habitation, you get a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around that. So Bob Beckman and Clive Schofield drew this map, and they reckon these are the islands that could theoretically support human habitation, and then drew lines from that. So, and then you have to divide halfway points from the island to the mainland, which is generous. It's a small island, it might only be 60-40 or 30-70, but say 50-50 maximum, okay? So instantly the U-shaped line shrinks from there to there. Okay, bear in mind that these two are Vietnamese occupied, that's Spratly, that's Amboina, the U-shaped line shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. None of these are occupied by the PRC, these are all Vietnamese or Philippine owned features or Taiwan itself, which means these are the only islands capable of supporting human habitation which are occupied by the PRC. So you see the U-shaped line shrinks from down there to up there. Okay, why should a Chinese government agree to a deal based on UNCLOS when it's going to lose that much? Yeah. So hence China has been putting all forwards arguments about historical rights, historical waters, historical title to try to undermine the UNCLOS arguments. The South China Sea is where two rival doctrines of international law collide, UNCLOS versus older ideas about historic rights and historic waters. And final point, China and Vietnam have a border dispute, a boundary dispute up here near the Paracel Islands. There's Hainan, there's the Vietnamese coast. There's a point here when it matters who has the rightful title to the islands. Because if it's Vietnam, the boundary would go that way. If it's China, it would go that way. But they have agreed a boundary to this point. But they could easily agree a boundary from here to here. So why don't they? Yeah, it would absolutely have no impact on the territorial claim here. It's because, I believe, this dash, the 9-dash line is here. If China was to agree to this, it would be arguing that this, or conceding that this dash is negotiable. And if you can negotiate one dash, you can negotiate 9 dashes. Yeah? So therefore, this dash is preventing a quite sensible boundary settlement between China and Vietnam in the north. So the 9-dash line, unfortunately, has a life of its own. That's a bit of a run through. There's an advert. Okay.
We're going to hear from Lyle Goldstein for a 10-minute presentation. And I should say, after this, as with all the panels, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions for any of the speakers since they're all done. So think of things that you're curious about. I'm sure we'll have a very interesting session. Is this okay?
Well, I guess. Well, thanks very much to the organizers. After that, that's a hard act to follow. I wonder if Bill is maybe making a solid case for a British claim to the these reviews. It's quite persuasive. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. I'm sure the name came up yesterday, but let me just say that Alan Lockman's scholarship here at Tufts had a huge influence on me as a young scholar, and I think we're all remembering him when we talk about China at Tufts. Michael kindly mentioned my new book, and I have a copy hot off the press. There it is. Thank you. I don't see a dime from it actually, because I work for the U.S. government, but yes, take money for books. But the general idea of the book is that I'll give my bottom line, as it were, up front, that I think that we, in many realms, but including in Southeast Asia and South China Sea, we're involved in what amounts to an escalation spiral between Beijing and Washington. And sort of each side is taking steps that are highly provocative. And the book is really an attempt to kind of say, how can we rein this in, this rivalry that seems to be spiraling in very dangerous directions. And so a chapter of that is on the South China Sea, and there are chapters on the Korean Peninsula, chapters on the U.S.-Japan, China Triangle, the U.S.-India China Triangle. Anyway, we can, I hope Mike get to present a bit more of it at Tufts at some point. But let me focus on the South China Sea, and I promise not to show you any maps. Well, I'd like to start just by running through some of the literature. That's how I spend most of my time, working through Chinese literature to try to understand Chinese viewpoints on this issue and many others. And just make the point that when we talked about this almost a decade ago, or maybe in 2007 is when this source is from. I think Chinese viewpoints were, there was somewhat moderate, and you can see that in this. Here was a debate that took place in the journal Jianchuan Zhishi. Fascinating debate. It was actually a pro-con, which you don't see often in the Chinese context. But there was a pro article saying the Chinese Navy should seek to control the Malacca Strait, and then there was a con saying, no, that's silly, we can't do it, it's beyond our capability. Moreover, there's really no reason to try to do that. That would just, turn the whole region against us. And by the way, the con article in this case gets much more press, much more play than the pro. So I think one has to think that the editor probably is sympathizing with the con. Here's an article in Wujushu Koshui, quite authoritative, I would say, from 2008. Surprisingly dovish, saying, look, it's not appropriate to put military forces into these very sensitive areas. Moreover, we have an approach to this, and our approach is negotiation, and that's the way we're going to approach this. So again, generally, you can call this kind of propaganda, and it's true, but I mean, in a way, this is what the top leadership in China, the senior military leadership, can agree on. So I think that this is quite encouraging, and this is in the 2008 timeframe. Well, things get ugly pretty quick after that. And by the way, if I had more than 10 minutes, I would show you, a lot more literature. I'm just showing you some highlights here. that's all we have time for. But here is Admiral Hu Yanlin. He was sort of #2 in the Chinese Navy for many years. And you can just read his thoughts. But I think there's, this is about as close as we can get as a window into the thinking of China's military leadership. You can believe he's very close to Admiral Wu Shengli, for example. But look at the quote in the lower right there. We will build the legal basis for the use of non-peaceful means. Okay, that I think is very, very hawkish kind of characterization, and should, I think, give us pause as we look at this. Here's some more kind of bitter bile. You can see there, saying, people shouldn't mistake. This is during the Scarborough Shoal crisis in 2012. And, rather very hawkish kind of. This is on the Chinese news, of course. Just evidence of more tensions, and I think the tensions have gotten, more or less grown worse and worse to this point. With a few, there's a few exceptions we could talk about, including the, I think, reasonably encouraging agreement that came out of the November meeting, the November summit in Beijing. We can talk about the agreement reached there, but here, this is some evidence, I think, of Chinese naval analysts discussing, let's say, the possibility that U.S. submarines are lurking off Chinese bases on Hainan Island, and they're discussing what are the tactics that need to drive U.S. submarines away. So I mean, when I say there are tensions building, you read about some tensions in the paper, other things you don't read about, and this is, again, very, very troubling kind of interaction among our armed forces. This is actually just saw this the other day, a discussion by a Chinese expert on electronics surveillance, and this is actually following that incident back in August last year, talking about how China sees this, and you can see among their defense analysts, they are very upset about this. I think I'm going to skip this one. I wrote this up recently on the National Interest, talking about how they view the, as it were, the threat that they see from Vietnam, for example. We can talk about that if you like. And this is also just from the other day. You can see April 2015 on the news. Big news when the U.S. Our Commander 7th Fleet stands on along with the Japanese admiral and says, we would like the Japanese to help patrol the South China Sea. That as you can all guess, that doesn't go over well in China. Not at all. Here's some of the evidence on that. Now, let me just spend the rest of, I think I have all of 3 minutes remaining. But okay, where do we go from here? Can we try to reverse this escalation spiral? And actually, so this is actually one of 10 spirals that I propose in the book, and I realize this is very hard for you to read out there, so I apologize for that. But let me zero in on what I see are some of the keys here and see if we can, if we want. I mean, my goal here is to kind of prompt a debate generally, both in Washington and in Beijing, to think about, compromise. It's a hard word, it's a dirty word in Washington. Nobody likes it. Everybody wants to be, extra macho, a hawk's hawk. But in my view, that is taking us to a very dark place very quickly. And I'm a military analyst, so I spend most of my time studying torpedoes and missiles and things like that, and their effects on people, and that makes, I think, should encourage all of us to think hard about compromise. So, what, just in a very basic form, what are the kind of steps I'm looking at? And again, I'm not even going to go through the baby steps that we need to start with, because you can't just go for big jumps right away. It's got to be gradual and reciprocal. But I'm talking about China improving its transparency by opening up that giant base on Hainan Island, not to the U.S., but to the ASEAN states, for example. If China could take that leap in transparency, could the United States reduce, not eliminate that, we couldn't do that, but we could reduce our surveillance posture, which is quite aggressive in my view. Now, if we could do that, and China, that I think is going a long way. Could China start to reform that U-shaped line? I think so. And one reason I think China could reshape that U-shaped line and clarify it a little bit more is that it's not, the Communist Party did not come up with that line, they inherited it. So they can kind of say, well, that was a stupid idea that the ROC came up with. So I think that may give a kind of out for the leadership. And there are many Chinese, you don't have to hang around in Beijing very long to meet many Chinese who themselves question the integrity and the use of that line. A lot of people see it as a problem. But how can we move on from there? I think the U.S. could come around to saying, you know, China's claim is actually not ridiculous. After all, the biggest of the Spratlys is occupied by Taiwan, which I consider part of China. But most critically, can the U.S. come around to see that bilateral negotiations are actually much more promising than we've been pushing multilateral negotiations, but I think, again, it doesn't take a political scientist to realize that multilateral negotiations are much, much more difficult to achieve, you know, any kind of lasting solution. And by the way, on that note, there is encouraging news. China and Vietnam have reached some, at least tentative kind of agreements just the other day, if you look at the news. And I mean, but that suggests that in some ways it is easier, you know, for two leaders to sit down and parse things out, or at least convince their respective bureaucracies, guys, we need to move toward a bit of a compromise. So anyway, I think this could be a promising way out. That's the way I see it. You know, there are many critics of my approach here, but, you know, my question back to them is, you know, what do you propose, you know, in order to get to a better place, besides, you know, more exercises, building more ships, you know, things that are just going to increase the intensity of the rivalry. So thank you very much for the time. Happy to talk more and share with you some of these other spirals which I have for other areas, not just military areas, but, you know, things like the difficult climate change issue as well. Thank you for your inviting.
Last but not least, we have Ivan Rasmussen, who's going to give a brief presentation.
Very brief, promise. All right. I do not have a book to plug, unfortunately, so I'm wondering how I even got invited. I think the answer might be, and Professor Beckley left this out, probably a lot of you know me not as Ivan the scholar, but as Ivan the teaching assistant, TA, and my boss is sitting at the table, so I better not screw this one up. Former boss, that's right. I have all those other jobs. So I'm Ivan Rasmussen, a PhD candidate here at the Fletcher School, and also a research fellow at the International Security Program at the Belfer Center. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to talk about these neighborly grudges in the context of Chinese nationalistic protests. Notably, I'm going to start with this. This is a part of a bigger project, which is dissertation, in brackets, maybe book, about what I call rational nationalism. I didn't come up with this as a term that was pulled off of the Strong Nation Forum in respect to nationalistic protest in 2005. This picture here, because I think something that we're all trying to get at with this symposium, which I've been to now like 4 years in a row, and it's just fantastic. And a lot of people are associated with it, not just Alan Walkman, who was an important influence, I think, on a lot of us. But what I'm trying to get at is the individual interaction between people from the U.S. and China, and I mean China writ large, and I mean the U.S. writ large, and kind of the sharing of things. This is a picture of a guy named Tong Jie. Tong Jie was the uber-nationalist extremist founder of the anti-CNN campaign in 2008, when there were some riots in Tibet, and they were covered / miscovered, according to Tong Jie, to the degree that CNN had hurt the Chinese historical sentiments about the world. I met Tong Jie in 2008. By the way, where every one of these cases of Chinese protests seems to be correlated directly with my being in China, which is a little bit weird. 2005, 2008, 2010, 2012, but we can talk about that as a different variable later on. But I met Tong Jie, and Tong Jie is supposed to be this uber nationalist, this crazy guy, right? But if you watch the video, I'm not going to play it because I already did Charlie Chaplin this morning, but if you watch the video, it's really insane and intense, right? I met Tong Jie, and he's a little bit of a kind of pudgy guy. I guess I shouldn't be talking too much, right? Very soft-spoken, really nice guy. I was introduced by Evan Osnos, who was writing for the New Yorker at the time, and he tries to pay for my meal. He even did pay for my meal. Anybody who's been to China, that as you know, somebody from the outside coming in, I got a free meal, yay! Not the first time that's happened. But what a nice guy, really interesting guy, very interested in American values, but yet an uber Chinese nationalist. There's something wrong with this picture, right? So my mind was kind of blown, so I became obsessed with this topic. Ironically, writing a paper for Alan Walkman's class on Chinese foreign relations for that, right? So we have now a story of this huge amount of Chinese nationalism. The question is, what's motivating it or not motivating it? And let's with this, I'm going to take a little small snippet and bore you for just a little bit on some methodology and these issues about protest whenever it does not emerge, right? This is a very hard thing to look at, right? We haven't, despite the escalations, despite the contestation of sovereignty, we have not seen so much protest in China concerning South China Seas. Now, have we seen protests in other countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam vis-a-vis these issues? Yes, and very much so. Here's a picture. Guess what? We get both Vietnam and Philippines flags in one picture. This is a picture of protests in Vietnam. These are the anti-China protests in 2014. So I'm going to look at two cases here, just two cases, part of a bigger study. You'll see some other stuff going on, which is Vietnam anti-China protests in 2014. The most violence against ethnic Chinese and Chinese since 1998. The Indonesia riots, whenever this is probably some of you weren't even born then, but Indonesia riots whenever after the financial crisis, whenever upwards of 1,000 ethnic Chinese were killed. Again, Indonesia in 1998, no protest in response to the protest of protest. You hear protest and nationalism a lot. So there's no why. The puzzling question is why no protest. There's a bunch of explanations for why protest emerges. First, Jessica Weiss has a book. She published her book before I could get all my stuff together. It's a fabulous book called Powerful Patriots. And Weiss argues that this nationalistic protest can be used as a kind of signal. So you let protest happen whenever you're really committed to an issue and you want the other side to give in to you, right? Or you stop it whenever you say, let's cooperate and work together. I think 2014 might tell that story a little bit, but it's complicated. The issue with that is the assumption that nationalism is completely controlled by the central government. And my research says it's a little more complicated than that. Next, nationalism is a product of the century of humiliation, national humiliation. I've just put one, but there's lots of people who make this argument. It's ingrained in the Chinese mentality. Again, that seems to go against this totally rational Tongjia picture that I presented at the onset. This is not just crazy, over-the-top nationalism, or is it? That's the question, right? Finally, there's this rent-seeking idea that, yeah, you'll see protests, and we'll talk about this with respect to the May protest, the Vietnam protest in 2014. You see basically domestic actors, so a provincial military group seeking to get some more money from the central government. And how do you do that? You ramp up the protest, you ramp up the nationalism. I'm not exactly buying this argument. So let's talk very briefly about protest in China and nationalism writ large, and then I'll dive into a couple of really quick case studies because I'm already halfway through my time. First, protest in China seems to me to have a particular focus with students and intellectuals. We can talk about 1989, but I'm not considering that necessarily in my set of cases of nationalistic against a foreign audience protest because it's domestic, right? But certainly that protest, my reading of it, and it's very complicated, was that protest really started to be cracked down upon whenever you saw workers from Danwei and stuff like that starting to join. So I think that's an important story. So students and intellectuals have some grounds for protest. You know, of course, things are very complicated, right? The number of incidents, interestingly, are reported by the Chinese government. There are statistics now. Whether or not these are good statistics, I think Gordon will push me on whether or not you get good statistics from China, right? Whether or not these are good statistics is a good question, but there's been an increasing number of protests. I argue that this is actually a central versus local thing, because most of these protests are against local governments over issues associated, I'm not the only person who argues this, by the way, there's issues associated with, let's say, land rights or a factory or corruption or something like that. And in this way, it's not really a major challenge to the CCP. Finally, we've seen this kind of increasing nationalism over time, and there's kind of a question of, is this indicative of Chinese foreign policy assertiveness? We've heard that maybe it's escalation, maybe it's territorial claims, maybe it's nationalism. There's competing literature out there on what it means to be assertive. So with this in mind, I constructed 2x2, it makes everything easier, right? You can think of a million factors that could influence why nationalistic protests would emerge, but in this case, I choose two that I think are really salient because I just dismissed the rest of them in the dissertation, which none of you will read, I hope, for your own sake, really, and not to question what I said too much. All right, so I look at this with respect to historical tensions and Chinese relative power, and I find that, this is not my favorite 2x2 that I have, but I find that right here at this moment where you're most likely to have protests is ironically whenever there's low levels of relative power. So China vis-a-vis the United States is a moment where there's more likely to be protests and high levels of historical tensions. Think of that as being a former colonizer of China, Japan, obviously, right? And then the geopolitical thing. So it's basically combining a couple of the arguments, geopolitics to some degree with historical tensions, right? Here are all the cases that I look at, but I'm gonna zero in on that bottom right-hand corner right there, the Taiwan fisherman shooting in 2013 and a Vietnamese anti-China protest. It should say just 2014, because that's the big one that I'm interested in. The red ones, obviously protests emerge, and I see that it fits my model pretty well. Obviously, there's some problems with it, but you can ask about those in Q&A or afterwards, because we do have limited time. So let's talk about the Taiwan fisherman case. So this is May 2013. Interestingly, May is important for me because I like to isolate things based on dates. Why is May important? Because of the May 4th movement. So you get this, there's a higher degree of likelihood of protest emerging in a temporal setting that's close to, say, May 4th or National Day. Also, remember I said earlier, students tend to be the protesters, right? Well, if you're off from school, then you're more likely to protest. Ironically, the most recent Hong Kong protests, not anti-foreign, happened when? National Day, whenever the students had free time. But it's not Hong Kong National Day. It's CCP 1949 National Day. All right, so down to my last 2 minutes. Let's talk about this Taiwan case, and I'll mention the Vietnamese one. Shooting with Taiwan, the Taiwan fisherman was shot by the Philippines Coast Guard, and they would recognize it now. And there were protests in Taiwan. Well, that makes sense, right? There also were protests in China. The mainland China responds to this. The fishing vessel apparently had been being a provocateur, as this happens in these maritime escalations to some degree, right? Global Times, which is a slightly uber nationalistic domestic media, labels the Philippines as the most barbaric country in the South China Seas. Oh, this is interesting. Now the Chinese Foreign Ministry also adds to this barbaric shooting. Why does the word barbaric matter so much? This is mine, right? It matters a lot in terms of Chinese national humiliation. It's, again, more dissertation and into the weeds than we have time for, right? And actually what you see is the Chinese netizens of these nationalists like Tong Jie and stuff like that posting the Chinese flag on Philippines government websites, right? Very uber nationalistic. It's all supported to some degree by the language, not only coming from media, but also from the government. And yet there's no protest. So strange. It would seem like everything's getting ramped up. There's vitriolic statements. There's escalations, that kind of thing. There's no initial apology from the Philippines, and none of this is really emerging as major protest. Eventually, though, there is a ruling that the Philippines does an own internal investigation, finds that the Coast Guard was at fault. Sorry, Professor Beckley, I'm almost there. And that perhaps might mitigate things. So why no protest here? I should talk about this. I think it goes back to my 2x2. There are a couple of competing arguments that would say, oh no, Ivan, you're so dumb about this. It's just a Taiwanese fisherman who was killed by a Coast Guard. It doesn't really matter that much, even though the language that I show got really ramped up, and I don't have enough time to do all the details, right? So it's just a small case. Well, let's look at a big case where there's no less historical grievances than, say, US or Japan, and even bigger violence and no protests, right? Huge anti-China protests in Vietnam. Again, a Taiwanese factory is attacked. It's like, oh God, these states they're confusing Taiwanese and Chinese and killing Taiwanese. I feel so sorry for the Taiwanese in this. It's really, really horrible. Sorry, I shouldn't be laughing. It's like, how do they make this mistake? The Chinese government actually allows 48 hours window for news broadcasts openly on the riots. Andrew Chubb has a great piece on this if you want to look that up, promote somebody else, right? And no protest emerges despite the severity of the issue. And however, you do see a lot of language online of these from the rational nationalists saying, oh, these are just, the poor Vietnamese, we can just economically squeeze them. And guess what happens? The Vietnamese government, like with the Philippines government, apologizes for transgressions. Okay, so let's talk about, I'll go through these really quickly. Sorry. So grassroots nationalism. The first thing I want to show as an indicator is that we do have a story here that from the grassroots nationalism can emerge as protest, but at least in the case of Vietnam in 2014, it did not. Signals can work both ways, right? Is this a story about domestic politics? I don't know. And finally, is there a lack of assertiveness here, or is it actually allowing for more government assertiveness? With that, I'm going to now open it up to any kind of questions. I know we've totally run out of time. You can point out if there's any errors in what I've said so far. I hate this. This is a joke because there are errors in this. This is a picture of, this is moving to a different set of protest values in Kaku Islands. These are protesters in this very kind of escalating region, landing on the Dalhousie and Kaku Islands, bringing their respective flags. The picture on the far right, kind of blurred out, is the one that was published in Xinhua, Chinese media, usually associated with government. And then this is the real picture, which actually, you can see there's some differences. Any issues? No. All right.
Okay, so I've been told from our overlords that are running the conference that we have 10 minutes, and because this conference is about you, I'm going to cede my questions, allow more time for you all to ask questions of our panelists. So if any you want to ask them, come up to the microphone.
Hi, I'm Winona. I'm part of Surge, and I'm also a freshman at Tufts University. My question is more toward Bill Hayton or Dr. Lila Goldstein, but it's really open to the panel in general. So we've talked quite a bit about China's hemming and hawing with UNCLOS and the lack of specifications of claims of islands within the 9 dotted line. So my question is, how can we pressure China to clarify their claims in the South China Sea? And do you think that this pressure must come from the US, UN, or within China itself, or any other place?
I'm not sure that necessarily clarifying is going to be a good thing, because once they've clarified it and they've nailed their cards to the mast, then it will make it more difficult to change their position. I kind of think in some ways that the present status quo isn't such a bad place to be. And if all the claimants could just agree to recognise the features that everybody else occupies and then take it from there, that wouldn't be such a bad position. The things that China occupies in the Spratleys are not legally islands, or at least are not capable of supporting habitation, so that would limit any zones that they could claim from it. They would then, if Vietnam and China could agree some kind of compromise with paracels, that would sort that out. I don't see China withdrawing from any of the territories that it occupies, and so therefore, why would it make a compromise? There's no force that's likely to make it give up anything. So, and I think what this ambiguity tells us a lot about how different forces in China regard the dispute. I thought maybe there are some people in the foreign ministry that might see this as the way forward, some kind of compromise, where people in the Coast Guard or the oil industry or the fishing industry, Hainan province, might say, you give this up, then you give up our fishing people's right to fish in these waters. So I think it's a tricky internal issue.
My view on this is that it may not be as hard to achieve as often made out. Partly, like I said, I think that this is because the PRC itself did not generate that line. That there, like I said, you don't have to go very far to find a lot of discomfort, including with the people who are most educated on the issue, meaning they're maritime legal scholars. I've been in the room with them. They're visibly uncomfortable trying to defend the integrity of the line. So what I'm saying is, but here's the key, I think, and you don't have to know a lot about Asian culture to understand the issue of face. And I think it's critical here that in this approach, we are not trying to to humiliate China, to put them in a position where they are definitely losers in all respect. In my view, a responsible approach here is one that basically grants them some face. It says, yeah, you have some kind of claim here. Chiefly, the paracels, but also, B2A, but the other features that they occupy too. And it's a minority of features, right? You saw Bill's map. They own very few of these actual features. So, they understand that their claim is not terribly strong. So the key here, and several specialists have proposed actual formulas here, but the key is to make it one in which China is assured of getting a cut. Maybe the best way to think about this is watch a few issues of The Sopranos. The big guy on the block gets a cut. Okay, but assuredly that cut is not 99.9%. it could. I think I saw one proposal with China's cut would be something like 5%. And I think that's probably a little low. But I mean, the point is, these are resources that are fungible. Everybody, more or less wants them to come out of the ground, and and that's possible. So I think compromise is the way to get China to reconsider this. And military pressure, by the way, could have the opposite effect. I think it fires up the nationalists in China, and they say, if we give on this, we're going to get rolled on everything, and China's going to get nothing. That is the opposite of the way to go.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about some of the provocative actions that the United States has taken in the region, and explain a little bit more about how some of those actions can be rolled back or dialed back in the context of trying to bring the situation to a more peaceful place.
Phil, identify yourself.
Is this for everybody?
For everybody, but particularly for Dr. Wilson.
Right, thank you very much for the question. I mean, I'm very resistant to kind of take an approach that says, one side is responsible for this mess and the other side is innocent. I mean, that's obviously not true. And China has kind of alienated so many countries in the region, and I think honestly, I think a lot of soul searching is ongoing in Beijing. Maybe this newest agreement with Vietnam suggests maybe that they have even turned a corner. So moreover, some of my students are out there on these ships, and some of them have had very close encounters, dangerous encounters that could even lead to conflict. And so I feel very, very personally when my students are out there that when some of these dangerous incidents have occurred and people have been killed. 2001, a Chinese pilot was killed, and it varied. By the way, anybody who looks back at that incident, we came within a hair's breadth of having 15 American Navy people killed in that. And believe me, the world would look quite different if those 15 Americans had been killed. All right, but let me get to the point there. So both sides are acting, in my view, in fairly provocative ways. What are the ways in which the U.S. could, let's say, take a more moderate approach? We have continuously, basically through the exercise of this so-called pivot, we have ramped up the program of exercises. I think the number of port visits of U.S. ships going through the Philippines is something like quadruple what it was several years ago. We're talking about now more or less permanent basing facilities back in the Philippines. That's a substantial upgrade of tension. Although, by the way, our defense relationship with the Philippines goes back so far and is more or less so strong that I think that is not over the top provocative. I think, but I think the level of surveillance that's going on along the Chinese coast, some numbers have been floated actually in the last year, more or less by the Chinese side. I couldn't confirm any. I don't follow that kind of those operations. But on the Chinese side, it's been said about 500 a year. Okay, and those operations are not an hour or something. Those are all day operations. So that's if you think about that, and you can look at the number of platforms involved, you can find that on the internet. That is a very intense effort. I think we can think about how to moderate that effort. Here's another thing, and I have this as part of my cooperation spiral too, is that to me, the United States having a close defense relationship with Vietnam, to me that is highly provocative and not helpful. And that's been a series of exercises, mostly symbolic, it's true. But that is, to me, that is the kind of thing like waving a red flag in front of the bullets. You don't have to know much U.S. history to know the Zimmerman telegram was, oh my gosh, the Germans are talking seriously with the Mexicans. Again, this is obviously going to cause severe anxiety in Beijing, and I think there is where moderation is needed and restraint.
I'll jump in really quickly because we brought up 2001, 2009, which are cases that I look at pretty seriously. And interestingly enough, we might have a disagreement at the panel here, but I would agree with that to some degree, taking a stronger stance after an incident is a good indicator for making the relations cool off a little bit. And in particular, in 2001, U.S. issued an explicit non-apology for the actions that had occurred. Now, who's to blame was still a matter of relative debate. We actually did not see protests in China in that case in 2001, not significant protests. And so that 2001 story, one of the reasons that protest doesn't happen is because there's no leverage to be gotten. There's no apology on the table. So it's just it's an interesting kind of, sometimes taking a hard line potentially on some of these issues could actually, I don't know, we might disagree with this.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry.
First and foremost, thank you for the whole panel. I really enjoyed the talk. Mr. Bill Layton, I'm actually reading a book right now. It's very good. So, I'm working from the library. So my question is for the whole panel. It's actually from yesterday's panel. Dr. Liu, who is currently the dean of the RSIS school in Singapore, he made the claim that in spite of the US pivot to Asia, despite whatever ASEAN is doing right now, the case for South China Sea is lost. 10, 20 years from now, China will be the dominant force in South China Sea. I wanted to know what's your perspective on this claim.
You know, I'm surprised at the pessimism, but it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, if you think that's what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen. And so that was my rejoinder, was that, in terms of the real estate, the Vietnamese control the territory. But obviously the facilities that China is building, the PRC is building in the sort of reefs that it controls are much more significant than what the others have. And so if they do turn out to be as big as we predict, although of course Vietnam has an island with a runway, Philippines has an island with a runway, and Malaysia does too. But I mean, you can see these things, I think, in two frames. You can see this as either a means of, China feeling vulnerable and wishing to project power closer to the Malacca Straits, because it feels that when people in the United States openly talk about offshore balancing, basically they're saying we're going to starve China to death in the event of a crisis. So it's not surprising that the Chinese start to think about some kind of counter policies to that. Or, so it's a defensive thing. It's also a means of projecting power further into the Spratlys, because when you look at the map, I mean, the Chinese Navy has to sail 1,500 kilometers down the coast of Vietnam to get to the Spratlys. That's an awful lot of places for ship missiles to hide. It's, the Vietnamese want to pick them off, and they've got to go all the way back even if they've got a problem with the ship. So you can see these things as sensible moves. I think maybe they are. I think two things. They are in some ways a response to the Philippines legal case, and if the Philippines wins, then China will just say, well, it doesn't matter. We're here. Just like the Israelis say in the West Bank, it doesn't matter what the law says. We're here. The other thing is, what happens next? And I think the next thing is that once they've built those bases, they might start to stick oil rigs on the James Shoal, on the Reed Bank, on the Vanguard Bank, and kind of start maybe extracting possibly.
Also, very, very, very quickly, there's another acronym, it's kind of mostly a joke, another acronym for UNCLOS. I don't know if you know it, but it's the Law of Seas Treaty. It actually used to be, you could tell, you get LOST. Yeah. Never mind. You actually could see, you go back and read some of the international legal arguments for this because the US had decided on UNCLOS. So where the US is standing on this is a very complicated position. Sorry, I'll turn it over to more of an expert.
Thanks. To me, that appraisal seems very pessimistic. Again, let's put up the map and see who has what. And if you think next year, China's going to attack 3 of the things, and every year, then next year they'll take 4, and then 5 more. That future, I think, is very fantastical. It's not going to happen that way. China would lose immensely if it were to resort to the use of force there. So I think China will continue to be kind of cautious. And yet, so in my view, what are these structures about? And I'm a military analyst. I don't view this as a major change in the military balance of power. I don't think they have great utility. I don't think that they can launch, some grand operations and as a result of this any more than they could, a year ago. So I think they're fairly, what they are is their symbols, right? They're nice pictures, so Xi Jinping can go back and say, see, I stood up to everybody else on the South China Sea, and I was tough, and this is all a negotiation. And by the way, in my view, this is not the view in Washington, but in my view, it is a negotiation. It should be a negotiation. Let them negotiate. Okay. And yes, there are going to be some military games surrounding the negotiation, but we should allow the negotiation. We should actually encourage the negotiation to go forward. Mostly, it's about money. It's also about kind of national symbols. But that is a positive process. In the meantime, restraint is needed to keep this from spiraling out of control. So, yeah, I don't think it's lost in any respect.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This is absolutely the last.
All right, I know we're short on time. I have permission from the overlords to ask this. Professor Beckley, we're all kind of curious what questions you have for the panelists. Do you have one, two?
I got a whole list.
I wish there was some more wishes.
I guess I'll go with some of the questions I have that combine several of the points of the speakers. So Professor Goldstein has sketched out this sort of action-reaction cycle and ways to reverse it. And I want to know what the other panelists thought about the prospects of reversing and breaking this cycle. In particular, this idea that if the United States were to reduce its surveillance activities in the South China Sea, that China might react to that in a positive way by clarifying its claims and clarifying it not in a way that says we own this entire thing, but clarify it in a way that actually de-escalates tensions. Do you think that that is possible, probable?
So I'll jump in very quickly. I would first say, in terms of something like the, I'm going to switch to 9-line for just a second. Something like that, the assumption there slightly is complete control of China of its foreign policy and some of its own behaviors in the region, which I want to disaggregate some of the actors within China. Andrew Erickson has a really good article on this about, for example, there's different views of what the actual 9-line is and stuff like that. So that's part of the challenge. So the assumption here is behind China's model, which I think would make sense as we move on, is one positive behavior would cause another positive behavior. And I would be hopeful for that. And coming from the lens of nationalism, we can actually see to some degree some of the language being toned down in the 2014 Vietnam case. So maybe there is this kind of rational, if we need to tone it down, therefore the other side will tone it down, give tit for tat in a positive sense. So yeah, I could potentially giving one example of that. I could see that. Yeah. Maybe not from the U.S. perspective.
It's funny because in October I gave a talk at the Naval War College, and Val was in the audience. And I thought I would sort of provoke people by trying to argue that the China threat had been overstated, for various political reasons, and that kind of just need to be simmered down and be calm. And it was about Val who put it out and said, well, actually they've got some pretty effective anti-ship cruise missiles, and maybe the US needs to be a bit worried about this. And so it's kind of and now I mentioned to somebody else, and they said, oh, Val Goldstein's a real hawk. And it's great to kind of, and now I kind of find myself on the other side. I mean, but I don't really find myself on the other side. I kind of agree with pretty much everything said. It's right. There's a different dynamic here. If the whole talk is about kind of going toe to toe and who's going to blink first and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's going to get really bad. And I try to explain this as there are two sets of disputes in the South China Sea. There are the territorial disputes about who has the strongest claim to which reef. And I'd have to know, you can lampoon some of the evidence, and the arguments that we use this as I'm trying to do, but that doesn't really get us anywhere. Yeah, because people still believe them, and if they believe them, then that's more important than facts. Yeah. So there's also a second, which is the sort of the US-China dispute about whose rules rule the world. Yeah. And if you conceive this bit of an international law that says, let's forget UNCLOS, you can just assert a historic claim over a vaguely drawn area of sea and call it territory, and that's a complete rewriting of international law. Okay? So when journalists like me write about this, we use sort of jargon like resource-rich, South China Sea, close to vital sea lanes of communication. That's not really what it's about. It's about the sort of vague notion of, kind of who sets the agenda. But unfortunately, that doesn't fit into the kind of the opening paragraph of the news story. Okay? So everybody kind of goes on about the fish and the oil and stuff. You can see that. But there are big strategic issues between the US and China and the South China Sea, and there are territorial disputes, and the two things are separate. The danger is if they overlap, and the US decides to kind of fight over some godforsaken reef, which has otherwise no strategic value whatsoever.
Respond.
Well, yeah, I welcome the thoughts of these experts, and I'm encouraged. By the way, I'm talking about anti-ship cruise missiles. I'm actually proud to say I'm quoted in the New York Times today. If you see the article on Chinese Navy naval modernization, and in that article I discussed a new missile. It's called the YJ-18. It's a supersonic missile. The U.S. has not fielded a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. This YJ-18 can be shot by submarine. The United States submarine force, which is very powerful, but does not have a weapon like this. So this is one more reminder. You know, people often ask me, "Are you a panda hugger, or are you a dragon slayer?" And I say, "I'm a dragon hugger," because you know I look at what the Chinese military is doing every day and what they're working on, and I have some respect for it. I see that these are very lethal platforms, and you know I have to believe that many of them will probably work if they're used against my students. So, you know, China's growing power inevitably. If you study world politics, I mean, this has an impact. And the United States and China more or less have no choice. We're both nuclear powers. We both have very formidable armed forces. So to avoid catastrophe, we have to find a way to compromise. Now, you know, how to get to a compromise? Nobody wants to compromise. I mean, actually, sorry, Professor Beckley, but the way you put my question was, you know, to discuss the spiral, the way you put it was, if the U.S. does this, then would China really do this? And I mean, I think here we have to look at the power of the spiral. That is, the spiral allows you to realize that there are compromises on both sides, and they start small and they move forward to bigger issues. So if you look at the compromise, actually before the U.S. really undertook any big step here, I'm asking China to make a major step on the transparency issue. But of course, diplomats are always stuck with this question, who goes first? Who would dare to compromise a little bit first? And that is where I would argue, and here's where I'm speaking to the students here, because I've lost all hope in Washington that anyone can talk rationally about foreign policy. But let me invite the students to think about what amounts to courage, political courage, and what amounts to rational diplomacy that really serves the interests of our people and prevents, you know, catastrophic wars. 100 years after World War I, we should really reflect on that part. Thank you.
Do I have time for more questions? No, I got plenty right here. All right, well, please join me in thanking all of our esteemed speakers.
I can also thank Professor Beckley, who has been this year's Surge Faculty Advisor. So, in closing remarks, it's the end of the symposium. But those of you associated with Surge know that Surge is not about endings. Surge is about new beginnings. So with that, Joe and I happily turn over the closing remarks to the young lady who will be taking the reins of Surge next year, Winona Sommer.
Thank you, Sean, for that wonderful final introduction. So, hello everyone. As you all know, I'm Winona Sommer, and I'm privileged to be the next director of Tufts Surge, the group consisting of the wonderful individuals who planned this year's China-US Symposium. First off, I would like to thank each and every one of you, the audience, for coming over the last 2 days and for making this year's symposium absolutely spectacular. As students, we've come from all over the world to come to Tufts and have come to the symposium over the last 2 days to study China-US relations. Now we are privileged to be sitting next to speakers and to be hearing from speakers who have also come from all over the world to talk to us about that topic. This is truly some common ground. I would first like to thank all the speakers who have come out to Tufts to share their research and experiences with us. Thank you for replying to our endless strings of logistical emails, to our confusing updates, and to our requests in the first place, especially if the requests consisted of only eager hope and a tweet in your general direction. Each of the panels were enlightening, and we can all walk away having learned a lot about Sino-US relations. Secondly, I would like to thank TCU and all the various organizations that have made this event possible. This includes Hemispheres. Thank you for partnering with us for the symposium and for organizing the breakout sessions. They were a great success, and I've heard a lot of interesting discussions. As for the two final thank yous, I would like to offer a personal anecdote. I'm a freshman who grew up in Hong Kong, and I'm an international relations and computer science double major here at Tufts. Half the reason why I chose Tufts over the other schools I was accepted to was because of this China-US Symposium. I participated in a Tufts International Students Jumbo Day a couple days after the 2014 symposium had occurred, and heard fantastic things about the quality of its speakers and the depths of its panel topics. I decided to do a little more research about the symposium and about China-US relations at Tufts in general, and this brought me to the IR department. Kathleen David, the IR head, pointed me in the direction of the China-US expert, professor of political science, and in her words, the rising star of the IR department, Professor Michael Beckley. I emailed him that April 2014 expressing my interest in China relations, excitement for studying at Tufts, and politely asked if he knew anything about the China-US Symposium, what he liked about it, what he didn't, what his favorite panel was, and got no response. Although, understandably, the rising star of the IR department definitely had better things to do than reply to a prospective freshman. But because I got no reply, I decided that I would have to come myself to the China-US Symposium and come to Tufts Surge as a result. So I would like to thank Tufts Surge's faculty advisor and my lovely major advisor, Professor Michael Beckley. I'd also like to thank you for never replying to my email. Like, still, it's 2015. And saving the best for last, I cannot express enough gratitude to the members of the Surge Planning Board who spent a huge amount of time to plan and execute the symposium itself. Thank you to the panel teams and panel leaders, regional security, culture, and environmental economy. Thank you for making this symposium so fantastic, for making the meetings run so smoothly, and for landing such illustrious speakers. To our marketing team, thank you so much for putting in so much extra time and effort to flyer, make posters, bring people to the event, and this long list of really great behind-the-scenes work. And to our fearless leaders, Sean Gunn and Joe Mark, thank you so much for being the two original members of Tufts Surge and for heading and organizing the symposium in the first place. So please give all of these people a hand. We at Tufts Surge hope that you have all learned a good amount about China-US relations over the last 2 days, whether or not you're a freshman, a senior, or even a speaker. Have a lovely rest of the semester and make sure you come to our symposium next year. Thank you so much.
Sorry, can we have Sean, Joe, and Penny Otis please come down to the podium? So this is on a more personal note, but I'd just like to present these gifts on behalf of Tufts Surge to our two co-leaders and our marketing director. I first got into contact with Sean back this past June to get involved with the China-US Symposium, and all three of the seniors that are with me here today, and you bet. I'm Joe. Nothing but, I think Bismarck said, blood and iron. Which, I mean, I wouldn't be that drastic in characterizing the determination that has gone into planning the symposium, but it certainly comes close. From the bottom of our hearts, on behalf of everybody at Surge that has been involved, thank you so much.
If I can just add really quickly, we have, as gifts for them, we brought them these Tufts card holders, and we hope that whenever they take these out to take or receive a card, they remember, this fantastic symposium that they accomplished. They envisioned and they made it a reality. So thank you guys.
Have a good rest of your day.
Oh yeah.